Welcome to today's deep dive. We're going to be tackling a really complex topic. It has to do with the 2020 and 2024 U.S. presidential elections.
Okay.
Specifically, we're going to be looking at potential irregularities. We've got a special counsel report to unpack, some really intense online discussions and analysis, and even some specific allegations about Donald Trump.
Right.
It's going to be a lot to cover, but that's what we're here for, to sort through it all and give you a clear picture.
Yeah, and it's a really interesting mix of information we have. We've got this official report, then we have public opinions and interpretations, and then finally we have these claims which are unsubstantiated. It just goes to show how difficult it can be to get to the truth these days, especially with all the information floating around online.
That's for sure. So let's start with that special counsel report. It really focuses on Trump's actions after the 2020 election.
Yeah.
And let me tell you, it's some pretty heavy stuff.
Yeah.
They actually found enough evidence to potentially charge him with felonies.
It really does lay out a systematic attempt to overturn the election results. This wasn't just a few isolated incidents. This was a coordinated effort to try to change the outcome.
Wow.
It involved pressuring officials, spreading misinformation, and even inciting the violence that happened on January 6th.
Yeah, and the report specifically talks about Trump pushing those false narratives about the voting machines and about voter fraud, even though his own advisors were telling him it wasn't true. It even mentioned something called fraudulent elector slates. I have to admit, I had never heard of that before.
Yeah, so essentially these were groups of people who were falsely claiming to be legitimate electors for Trump, even though he lost the popular vote in those states. And they submitted these fake certificates to Congress in an attempt to disrupt the official vote count.
Wow. That sounds like it's straight out of a political thriller.
It does.
So they had enough to charge him with crimes, but then they dropped it because he got reelected.
Yeah. Well, the report was released after his reelection, and the Department of Justice has a policy against indicting a sitting president. So even though they lay out all of this evidence, it doesn't lead to any formal charges.
Okay, so what happens now? He just gets away with it because of this policy.
That's a question that a lot of people are debating right now, both legal scholars and political commentators.
Yeah.
It really highlights this tension between accountability and not interfering with the president's ability to govern.
Yeah. It's a tough one for sure. All right, so let's move on to those online discussions that we pulled. It's definitely more opinion-based, but there are some recurring themes. What's your take?
I think the biggest one has to do with the weaponization of misinformation. People are very concerned about how propaganda and false narratives are being used to potentially sway elections and manipulate opinions. And social media is definitely the main place where this is happening.
I've seen a lot about Elon Musk and his influence too. Some people were even saying that he's trying to become the next Trump. I even found a quote online that said, "Elon Musk knows Donald Trump is a walking corpse, and he's intentionally trying to steal the Nazi zeitgeist from him."
Wow, that's a pretty intense statement. It definitely shows the emotions surrounding all of this and how online discussions can sometimes veer into just pure speculation. What we need to do as critical thinkers is be able to discern between informed analysis and pure conjecture. We need to look at the evidence before we draw any conclusions.
Absolutely. Another quote that stood out to me was one that said, "They told you they would do Nazi things. They are now going to do Nazi things." It seems that some people are comparing Trump to historical examples of authoritarian regimes.
And those kinds of comparisons can be useful, but they can also be misused. We need to be careful not to fall into the trap of making simplistic comparisons or using really emotionally charged language without the right context.
That makes sense. So let's move on to something more specific.
Yeah.
Those allegations about the 2024 election. Before we get into it, I just have to mention that this is coming from a single source, so we need to be skeptical.
Multiple sources are always key to verify information, especially when it comes to controversial claims. So what are the allegations?
Okay, this source claims that a voting machine was stolen back in 2022 by a Trump supporter. That there was this group called Lions of Judah that was training people to infiltrate polling places. And that there were all of these bomb threats at voting stations on Election Day, which they say might have disrupted the chain of custody for ballots.
Ah, yes, the chain of custody. So that refers to that process of tracking and documenting how the ballots are handled to prevent any kind of tampering. So the implication here is that those bomb threats were a way to cast doubt on the election.
Oh, wow. That sounds pretty intense. They also claim that there were massive vote swings in Trump's favor in certain counties that all used a particular type of voting machine. And on top of all of that, a lot of people are reporting that their mail-in ballots were never even counted.
If true, that'll suggest that there might be a vulnerability in our voting infrastructure. But it's important to note that we don't have corroboration from other sources. So we can't say for sure what happened, or whether these were isolated incidents or part of a larger pattern.
Right, so let's shift gears completely and talk about Trump's financial history.
Okay.
I mean, let's be honest, it's always been kind of a roller coaster.
Yeah, it definitely has.
What do you make of all of that?
Well, his business dealings and financial practices have been under scrutiny for decades now, and a lot of these allegations raise questions about whether his past behavior is relevant to understanding what's going on now.
Yeah, we've got this whole list of Trump's failed businesses. Casinos, airlines, you name it. He's probably bankrupted it. There are accusations of him dodging taxes, lying about his wealth, and basically using his position for personal gain.
It really makes you question his motivations. Are his actions driven by a desire to serve the public, or is he just out for himself? One example that comes to mind is the Trump University case.
Oh, yeah, that whole thing where he was accused of defrauding those students.
Yeah.
Didn't he have to pay out millions in settlements?
Did, and that case, along with his bankruptcies and tax evasion allegations, really paints a picture of someone willing to exploit others for personal gain, even if it means breaking the law.
It definitely raises some concerns. And we can't forget about those felony convictions for falsifying business records. Plus, he had to shut down his charity because he was using the money for personal stuff. Not exactly a shining example of ethical behavior.
Not really.
Okay, so last but definitely not least, we need to talk about those concerns around Trump's authoritarian tendencies and rhetoric. This feels crucial to understanding what's going on.
Absolutely. This is where it gets into the very heart of our democracy and the potential for abuses of power.
People are pointing to his admiration for strongman leaders, his constant talk about enemies and vengeance.
Yeah.
Plus that whole thing where he said he'd be a dictator on day one.
Yeah, that comment definitely raised eyebrows, even if he was trying to make a joke. It made people question his attitude about governing.
I have to admit, it did feel like he was trying to downplay how serious his words were. And even if we do take that statement with a grain of salt, there's still a lot of concern about his overall approach to governing. He seems to have this my way or the highway attitude, and that doesn't really inspire confidence in a democracy.
It's definitely important to look at his actions as well. He's consistently expressed a desire to expand executive power, purge his opponents from government, and use the military to enforce his policies. This combination of authoritarian tendencies and aggressive rhetoric has understandably fueled anxiety about the future of American democracy.
It definitely feels like he's trying to create a system where he is unaccountable. And then he's also made it clear that he wants to go after anyone who criticizes him.
Targeting the media and trying to silence critics are classic tactics of authoritarian leaders. And a free press and the ability to dissent are absolutely essential for a healthy democracy. So these concerns about Trump's intentions are valid.
So we have this report that details a potential attempt to overturn the 2020 election. We have all of these online opinions and speculation, and then we have these allegations about Trump's actions and character. It's a lot to process.
It is.
What do you think people should take away from all of this?
Well, it's a very complex issue, and there are no easy answers. I think it's important to remember that we presented a range of perspectives and evidence, and ultimately it's up to each individual to evaluate the information and form their own conclusions.
All right, this deep dive is really just a starting point. It's a way to get you thinking critically about all of this. But here's a question I want to leave you with. Given everything we've talked about, how confident do you feel in the integrity of the U.S. electoral system? It's something to think about as we move forward.
It is. The health of our democracy depends on engaged and informed citizens. We need people who are willing to defend its principles. So this is just the beginning of the conversation. We all need to make sure that our elections stay fair and secure. It really is something to think about, all of the challenges that we face. Speaking of challenges, I think there's another aspect to this whole situation we should look at. Trump's history of financial misconduct.
Yeah, you're right. We touched on it earlier. But this idea that his past behavior might actually shed light on his political actions now.
Exactly. So many sources suggest that Trump's history of exploiting others, his blatant disregard for the rules, his constant need to come out on top could all be clues as to why he's making the moves that he is.
Okay, so we have this list of failed businesses, the shady dealings, and then the felony convictions. Some are saying this pattern of behavior shows his true character.
It really raises questions about his motivations. Is he really trying to serve the public good? Or is this all just about what he can get out of it, what's in it for him? The Trump University case comes to mind.
Right, where he was accused of defrauding those students. He had to pay millions of dollars in settlements.
Yeah, he did. And when you take that case, along with all the others, The bankruptcies and the accusations of tax evasion, it just paints this picture that he is willing to do whatever it takes to get ahead, even if it means hurting other people, even if it means breaking the law.
It makes you wonder how far he would go if he were back in the White House.
Right, and there's another layer to this. He seems to surround himself with people who just enable him. His inner circle is full of yes men, people who are going to back him up no matter what he does, even when he's clearly in the wrong.
It really makes you think about how someone in power can basically operate without any consequences.
It's the enablers. They're the ones who allow this to happen. Family members, business associates, political allies. They either turn a blind eye or they actively participate. They create this culture where nobody is held accountable, and that's a really dangerous situation, especially in a democracy.
It's like the kid. You are the company you keep. And the company Trump keeps has definitely raised a lot of red flags over the years. Rudy Giuliani,
Yes.
Steve Bannon. These are people who have been fiercely loyal to him, even when he's doing stuff that is clearly questionable.
Exactly. And when you see that kind of loyalty to someone who is so unpredictable, it makes you wonder, who would he surround himself with if he got a second term? Would he actually prioritize loyalty over expertise, over integrity?
It's a scary thought.
It is.
Okay, so we've talked about the special counsel report, all those online discussions,
Yeah.
the allegations about the 2024 election, Trump's finances, and his tendency to surround himself with these enablers. Is there anything else we should highlight?
There's one more piece of the puzzle we haven't fully explored yet. Trump's personal relationships.
You mean beyond just his advisors and allies, his family?
Yeah, his family played a big role in his first administration. But the sources that we're looking at, they really suggest that things might be even more complicated than they appear on the surface.
Interesting. So what are these sources saying?
Well, for one thing, they suggest that Trump is incredibly sensitive to criticism, especially from those he considers close to him. He reportedly values loyalty above all else and can lash out at anyone who betrays him or questions his authority.
I can definitely see that. I've seen how he behaves publicly. He doesn't seem to take criticism well, and he can be vindictive.
Right, so when you take that hypersensitivity to criticism and you combine it with his impulsiveness and lack of self-control, it makes him vulnerable to manipulation.
So you're saying that his family and close friends could potentially be used to influence his decisions?
It's a possibility. The sources highlight instances where Trump's personal relationships have really blurred the lines between his private life and his public responsibilities. His daughter Ivanka and Jared Kushner held senior positions, despite not having any experience. And there were all of those allegations that they were using their positions for personal gain.
Right, like leveraging their access to Trump for business deals and political favors.
Exactly. And those allegations, whether true or not, show a serious lack of judgment. And they point to the fact that Trump is willing to put his own interests ahead of the country's.
So how do we know for sure that his personal life is directly influencing his policies?
Well, it's not necessarily a direct line,
Yeah.
but we need to remember that politicians are human. They have their own emotions and motivations.
Right.
And their personal experiences and relationships can definitely affect their decisions, even if they don't realize it.
So all of that, all of his past behavior, being vindictive,
Yeah.
sensitive to criticism, all of it could affect his political decisions.
Absolutely. We need to take all of it into consideration when we try to understand his motivations and when we try to predict his actions.
Okay, we have covered a lot of ground here.
We have.
We have explored the irregularities surrounding both of the elections. We dove into Trump's financial history and his authoritarian tendencies, and then we examined how his personal relationships might influence him. My head is spinning. What do you think are the main takeaways?
I think the most important thing to remember is that this is complicated. There aren't any easy answers. We tried to show you all the different sides and all the different evidence, but it's up to you to decide what you believe.
I agree. This deep dive is just a starting point. It's meant to get you thinking. But there are some questions that I think you should really consider.
Like what?
What does all of this say about the state of American democracy? Is it as resilient as we think it is? Or is it more fragile, more susceptible to being manipulated?
Those are great questions. We have seen just how easy it is for misinformation to spread. We have seen how those in power can take advantage of the system and how even the institutions that protect us can be undermined. It's scary. It's a wake-up call. We cannot take our freedoms for granted.
I think it's also important to ask ourselves, what does this say about us? Are we going to hold our leaders accountable? Or are we just going to look the other way? Are we willing to have real conversations? Or are we just going to retreat into our own little bubbles and demonize anyone who disagrees with us?
Those are really tough questions, but we can't ignore them.
Yeah.
If we want to preserve our democracy, if we want to build a better world, we need to confront these issues head on.
We can't be complacent.
No, we can't be apathetic. We need to be informed. We need to vote. We need to hold our leaders accountable.
I agree. And it's going to take all of us working together to make a difference. We can't do it alone.
We can't.
We need to work together.
Absolutely.
So before we finish up, I want to go back to something we talked about a little earlier. Those allegations about the 2024 election.
Okay.
You mentioned this idea of democratic backsliding. Can you explain that a little bit more?
Sure. Democratic backsliding is a term that political scientists use to describe what happens when democratic institutions and norms start to erode. It usually happens really gradually through things that might even seem legal, which makes it really hard to see and even harder to stop.
So it's sneaky. It's like it's happening under the surface.
Exactly. Think about termites eating away at a house. You don't see the damage right away, but eventually the whole thing could collapse.
Okay, that's a helpful analogy.
Yeah.
So how does democratic backsliding connect to the allegations?
Well, some of the things that are being alleged, if they're true, could be examples of this backsliding.
Like what?
Like that voting machine that was stolen. That raises concerns about election security and the potential for tampering.
Right, and then there's that group, the Lions of Judah,
Yeah.
training people to infiltrate the polls.
Exactly. If that's really happening, it means that there are people who are actively trying to undermine the election.
And don't forget about all of those bomb threats at the voting stations.
Right. Disrupting the chain of custody for the ballots.
It's scary to think about.
It is.
It makes you wonder if this was all coordinated to create chaos and make people lose faith in the elections.
And then there are those vote swings that seem to favor Trump in counties using a specific voting machine. If that's true, then our technology is vulnerable. It could be manipulated.
And we can't forget about all of those mail-in ballots that were never counted.
Right. And while some ballots are rejected for legitimate reasons, if it's happening on a large scale, it could mean that people are being deliberately kept from voting.
So how do we know if this is actually happening? What should we be looking out for?
Well, one thing is checks and balances. Those are supposed to prevent any one part of government from becoming too powerful. If those are weakened, that's a bad sign.
What else?
Look at press freedom. Are people being silenced? Are there attacks on the judiciary? Are people trying to get around the law?
It feels overwhelming. Like, what can one person do?
It's easy to feel that way. But we, the people, we have the power in a democracy.
I know, but it doesn't feel like it.
We can vote. We can speak out. We can hold our leaders accountable.
That all sounds good. But how?
Stay informed. Talk to people about what's going on. Support organizations that are fighting for our democracy. Tell your elected officials what you think. And vote.
I know voting is important.
It is.
But does it really make a difference?
Change takes time. It takes effort. But we can do it.
I hope so.
You're not alone. There are so many people who care about this. Connect with them. Work together.
Okay, that's good advice. We have definitely explored a lot today, and I think we have given everyone a lot to think about.
I agree. It's been great talking to you about all of this.
You too. And to everyone listening, thank you. Thank you for being part of the conversation. The more we know, the better prepared we are to face the challenges ahead. Keep asking questions. Keep fighting for what you believe in. We'll see you next time for another deep dive.